excited to be here. This idea of commemorating Morgan's raid started 10 years ago when David Mowry approached the city and said, hey, we got this great idea. We're going to put these signs up over the next year or two. Well, you know, historical things, they take a while, so it took 10 years to get here, but it's pretty exciting to think about the fact that we're commemorating Morgan's raid. So if you can imagine being here on this morning, 150 years ago, and seeing the Confederate soldiers out here raiding the barn. I also want to call your attention to little Wilson Hunt up in the window up there. You'll hear a little bit more about him in just a minute. But I did want to welcome everyone. We're really excited. We've got a number of dignitaries, and I'm going to start off with Tom Bell, who's president of the Blue Ash Historical Society. Oh, maybe I should go
I guess this morning.
It's his story. All right,
for today's event, I'm going to be portraying John Gray Hunt, my great-grandfather, and I'm really honored to be representing my family in this, and for the whole historical society. You know, I grew up visiting my grandparents on what was then their little farm here in Blue Ash, and they'd tell me the stories, Morgan's raid, and all our family history, and at that time I could look out those windows and still see and imagine what it must have been like, because there were still cornfields and still cow pastures out here. But I think it's important as a historical society that we carry on all those stories, and I want to take this time to kind of clarify something. The Historical Society and the Hunt House is about much more than the Hunt family or the Hunt history. This is about all of Blue Ash history, all of our families, and we want to save all these old stories for the future generations. Contrary to popular belief, you can't find everything on the internet. I learn new stories every time we do another. I want to encourage people to keep coming here and sharing your stories with us, and we can share ours with you. So, and I think this trail is going to be yet another way for us to share it with more and more people. So, I'm happy to see it coming. And I'll introduce you to the man who got it all started, David Mowry.
10 years ago, that's a long time, when I first met Tom and his mom, Betty Hunt Bell. Betty was already talking about the history of her house and how much she wanted to save it, and she heard my talk at Montgomery back then on Morgan's raid, and I talked about this house because I had researched it separately and knew the history of it. And when she heard that, I think she knew what she had to do. And because of the Blue Ash City Council and because of Tom and Betty, we have the house today in perpetuity saved, and the history of this house saved. And of course the Morgan's raid story behind it is saved for all generations to come. And that's what makes me most proud about this trail, is how much the history of Morgan's raid has brought attention to some of these historic places like the Hunt House, and has given these communities something else to think about their historic heritage, and also about the places that are around them and how much those things may mean to them in the future. So I'm very, very happy about what happened over the years with this place especially, because it's so beautiful. Well, 150 years ago today is when John Hunt Morgan arrived in this area. And in fact, he was down here on Plainfield Road, just less than a half a mile away. And his men were looking for horses primarily in this region, trying to keep their long sustained ride around Cincinnati, the longest continuous cavalry ride in American military history. 85 miles in 35 hours from Sunman, Indiana to Williamsburg, Ohio. In order to do that, they had to keep taking horses and food from the civilians. And the Hunt House, of course, was one of those civilians' houses that was affected. In fact, the Hunts kept several horses here. Some reports say 10 horses were taken. The official reports that were submitted to the state of Ohio were 10, where 6 horses were taken out of the barn that was back here. The 6 horses, of course, they've received 2 of them back after Morgan was captured later on in the month. But the other 4 horses, they lost forever. Most of them went back to the Union Army because the Union forces needed just as many horses for the continuing war effort. So those 4 horses were eventually reimbursed to the Hunts through a commission that was set up by the state of Ohio to reimburse lost property. And that's how we found out about at least the financial loss that was made here. Now the story behind Wilson Hunt, I guess, do you want to tell it? Okay. So as Morgan's men passed down Plainfield Road, they were scouting in this area, all the farms that they could find. They would knock at the door, typically, of the house and ask for food, water, and also their horses. They usually asked politely. They were told to treat civilians with respect, so they would ask politely. They were not, if they weren't invited into the house, they would not enter the house. But if they were invited, they would go in. I don't know what happened here. The Hunts didn't leave any record as to whether or not they invited the Confederates into the house, but certainly they probably were talked to. And of course, they knew where the horses were. They went to the barn first, and there they were. 6 really nice horses waiting to be taken. They were led across the lawn here. Hunt Road existed in 1863, so they probably took them back to the main column. And from there, they were gone for good, except for the 2 horses that were later captured by Union forces. But during that time, as the horses were being led across the lawn, John C. Hunt, whom Tom is portraying, and his young son, 10-year-old Wilson Hunt, stood up here in the windows and watched as Morgan's men led the horses across. And the story goes that as those horses were being led, Wilson asked his father, "What are you going to do about this situation? You're losing your horses." And Mr. Hunt said, "Well, son, there's not much that I can do. You can't stop an army." And that's going to be the title of this particular sign. You can't stop an army. Many civilians that day felt the same way, hopelessness as they saw their property being lost. And in those days, 1 horse could be a whole year's wage. For John C. Hunt, he was a wealthy farmer, so losing 6 horses was a big deal for him too. And I'm certain that these guys had to work for many years to really get back to normal again, because it was like a major piece of devastation. They didn't have insurance in those days for their horses typically, so they would have to work and get that property back through extra effort. But the general raid, of course, was the longest raid in the Civil War. It was also the raid that took Confederate forces the farthest north of any other Confederate force from the southern states. Morgan made it as far as near Steubenville, Ohio, about 12 miles from the Pennsylvania border. And by that time, his 2,500-man division that he had started out in Tennessee with had whittled down to 360 men. He only had 500 men that made it back to the Confederacy. The rest were all captured or killed or wounded on this raid. However, his main objective that had been given to him by General Braxton Bragg, his commander, was to divert Union forces away from Southern forces. And he did indeed do that. In fact, he diverted 130,000 Union troops in his wake. All 130,000 were on his path, converging on him, until he was captured up near West Point, Ohio. So even though Morgan lost his division, he did accomplish his mission, and certainly was able to cause a rift in the Confederate Union arena in the West, which is primarily the area around Tennessee, so much so that it led to the Battle of Chickamauga, and also to a Confederate victory at Chickamauga. So Morgan's raid definitely had an effect on the war, but it didn't have an effect on the end point of the war, of course. because it confers the obviously lost. But I think what we gather here today is the fact that 150 years ago we had an enemy on our soil, and it was right here. And that steadfastly our Union forces and our Union militia stood by and defended their towns, defended their homes, defended their property against these Confederate forces, and eventually prevailed. So I hope you enjoy the 557-mile John Hunt Morgan Heritage Trail, which is now complete. All the markers are in place, all the signs are in place. You can follow it from start to end, from Harrison, Ohio, all the way up to West Point, Ohio, continuously marked without a map. And we'll have a guidebook available also for you to follow, which will be available in about 2 weeks. The guidebook has a lot more detail on the Ohio portion of the raid and will allow you to travel other routes besides the ones that are marked, like this one. So if you have any questions, I'm here today. Feel free to ask me, but congratulations to the city of Blue Ash, to the Blue Ash Historical Society, and to all of you who are looking forward to following our Civil War in Ohio trail. So thank you very much.
This all historically correct. I just want to set the stage for you. If you can imagine that morning on July 14th. At that time, if you see the rise back here, you can see a little bit of a rise in the grass. That's where the barn sat. As a youngster, when I grew up just down the street, I used to play in that barn. But if you can imagine that, up there on the rise, you know, horses coming out of that barn and going out here. Of course, none of these homes were here at the time. There was homes, though, up on, if you know the Conklin home, the old Conklin home on Cooper Road, there was a home there. There was also the Johnston farms up on Zigzag in Kenwood, the Heitmeyer farm, and this one I need help. It's Shank home down in Deer Park. Yeah. Dorman farm, that house was there. What other ones were in at the time around here?
The Williamson house still stands up off of Cornell.
So I just wanted to give you an idea of the other homes that are still in our community that were here that time. Now, part of the reason we know about those homes is in 1865, the state of Ohio provided compensation for everyone that lost. And I was actually going through the records this morning, just kind of looking at them. It was everything from $3 for a coat to $125 for a horse. And in fact, I saw an $8,300 compensation to rebuild a bridge over the Little Miami River. So there's some really interesting anecdotes. By the way, if you want to go look at the list that's available on the website, if you just search for Morgan's Raiders claims on the internet, you'll see the list real quickly. So I found that kind of interesting, and thought I'd share that with you, just to set the scene here for a little bit for 150 years ago. The other thing to remember, this raid happened just a few weeks after the Gettysburg battle, right? Yeah. So, you know, here the South had just had a significant loss in Gettysburg, and this general, Brigadier General. Yeah, Brigadier General launches this raid up through Ohio. So you can see how close it was to other really significant events here in the Civil War. So with that little bit, I'm going to introduce Mayor Mark Weber for a few comments.
Thanks, Jim. Afternoon, everyone. If you have any doubt that history is not a living, breathing thing, take a look at the Hunt House. There's no better evidence that history is not something in books that no longer exists. It still exists among us. And we're here today to commemorate the impact that Morgan's Raiders had on the city of Blue Ash during a very difficult time for our nation. And most people in Blue Ash, I didn't know really a lot about it until Jim started pushing saving the Hunt House, and he was very instrumental, along with the Bell family, in making sure that this place was preserved. And it's part of our city's heritage. It's our obligation to continue to preserve it and hopefully to educate the people in our city and those